August 1970, Ford was sitting on top of one of the wildest horsepower wars America had ever seen. Chevrolet had its 454, Chrysler had the 426 Hemi, and Ford had a weapon that had already earned a reputation on the street and at the drag strip, the 428 Super Cobra Jet. On paper, Ford called it a 428, 428 cubic inches, a big block FE V8 that had been around for years, but that number didn't tell the whole story. Because the Super Cobra Jet wasn't just another 428, it was the version built when Ford expected the driver to do something unreasonable with it. Order the drag pack, and Ford transformed the already serious Cobra Jet into something far more sinister. You got special heavy-duty internals, forged pistons, stronger Le Mans-style connecting rods, an oil cooler, and aggressive rear gearing designed to put all that torque directly onto the pavement. The package wasn't cheap, but it wasn't designed to be. It was designed to survive what was coming next. And then, after 1970, it was gone. Not detuned, not gradually forgotten, gone. Ford replaced the 428 with an entirely different big block architecture. So why would Ford walk away from one of its most feared V8s at the exact moment the muscle car war was reaching its peak? Most people blame emissions, and they're not completely wrong, but that's only part of the story. The real answer is a collision between engineering, changing regulations, economics, packaging, insurance, and a muscle car market that was beginning to turn against the very machines Ford had spent years creating. And once you understand what happened inside that 428, the disappearance makes a lot more sense. The story begins before the Super Cobra Jet ever received its name. Ford's FE engine family had been around since 1958. It powered everything from full-size Fords to Thunderbirds, Galaxies, Fairlanes, and eventually some of the most famous performance cars Ford ever produced. The FE designation itself stood for Ford Edsel. That tells you how far back this architecture went. The engine family had seen multiple displacements over the years. The 332, the 352, the 390, the 406, the 427, and finally, the 428. Each one was designed for a slightly different purpose, but they all shared the same basic architecture: heavy cast iron construction, robust main bearings, a design philosophy that prioritized durability over lightweight. The 428 arrived as one of the largest members of that family. Its bore measured about 4.13 inches. Its stroke was just under 4 inches, at 3.98 inches. That combination produced 428 cubic inches, or about 7.0 liters. And unlike a small block designed around lightweight and compact dimensions, the FE was built like an industrial machine. The block alone weighed over 200 pounds. Add the heads, the rotating assembly, the intake manifold, the exhaust manifolds, and all the accessories, and you were looking at an engine that tipped the scales at around 650 to 700 pounds in running trim. That's enormous, but that mass had a purpose. It meant the engine could absorb incredible amounts of stress without grenading. The Cobra Jet version used a 4-barrel carburetor, high-flow cylinder heads, heavy-duty components, and a compression ratio around 10.6 to 1 in the 1968 to 69 configuration. By 1970, the advertised output was still only around 335 horsepower, while torque was rated at roughly 440 pound-feet. That horsepower figure sounds almost disappointing today. It wasn't. Ford's advertised numbers were conservative, and the engine's real weapon was torque. 440 pound-feet meant the engine didn't need to scream to move a heavy Mustang. It could simply hit the throttle and shove. The torque curve was thick and wide. Peak torque arrived at just 3,400 revolutions per minute. That's tractor territory. And it meant the driver didn't need to wind the engine to redline to make things happen. Just stomp the accelerator somewhere around 3,000 revolutions per minute and hold on. But Ford wasn't satisfied. Drag racers wanted more, not necessarily more horsepower. They wanted an engine that could take the abuse of repeated quarter-mile passes without coming apart. So Ford created the Super Cobra Jet package. And this is where the 428 became something different. The Super Cobra Jet wasn't simply a Cobra Jet with a bigger carburetor. Ford strengthened the engine where it mattered most. The SCJ received forged pistons and heavy-duty Le Mans-style connecting rods using stronger cap screws. The bottom end was designed to survive the punishment of repeated hard launches and sustained high-load operation. Those Le Mans rods were crucial. They were stronger than the standard powder metal rods used in the regular Cobra Jet. The cap screws were larger. The beam was heavier. The big end was reinforced. These weren't the kind of components you needed for cruising to the grocery store. They were the kind of components you needed when you planned to bounce the engine off the rev limiter while the rear tires clawed for traction. Then came the oil cooler. That detail is easy to overlook. It shouldn't be. When you're producing enormous torque and repeatedly making full throttle passes, oil temperature becomes a survival issue. The oil isn't just lubricating the engine, it's carrying heat away from the bearings and other critical components. If that oil overheats, its ability to protect the engine falls, the viscosity drops, the protective film becomes thinner, and when bearing protection disappears inside a big block running under extreme load, things can go bad very quickly. Ford understood that, so the SCJ wasn't just about making power, it was about surviving power. And then Ford connected the engine to something even more important, gearing. The drag pack could bring 3.91 or 4.30 rear-end ratios into the equation, depending on the configuration. With the aggressive 4.30 gears, the engine could launch the car with an almost violent mechanical advantage. Most street cars came with gearing around 3.00 to 1 or maybe 3.25 to 1. That was civilized, that was reasonable. That allowed the engine to turn relatively low relative per minute at highway speeds. But 4.30 gearing was something completely different. It was designed for one thing: acceleration. Imagine dropping the clutch. The engine doesn't politely accelerate the car. It hits the rear tires with a wall of torque. The rear suspension compresses, the front end rises. And if you didn't have enough weight over the rear axle, the tires simply broke loose and painted black stripes down the asphalt. That was the point, but there was a problem. The 428FE wasn't a young engine anymore. By 1970, Ford knew the future belonged to a newer generation of big blocks. The company had already developed its 385 series engine family. And sitting inside that family was something much larger, the 429. The 429 was not simply a bored-out 428. It was a different architecture, different block, different cylinder head design, different breathing characteristics, different future. The 385 series had been introduced in 1968, initially as a replacement for the aging ML big block family that Ford had used in luxury applications. But Ford's engineers saw potential for something more. The 429 used a canted valve cylinder head design that gave the valves a more favorable angle for high airflow. In Cobra Jet form, the engine could use massive intake and exhaust valves and a high-flow induction system. The intake valves measured 2.24 inches. The exhaust valves were 1.72 inches. Those were enormous. And the canted valve design meant the valves could be even larger without running into each other or compromising combustion chamber shape. Ford's new big block was being positioned to take over, but Ford didn't immediately kill the 428 everywhere, and that detail matters. For 1970, different Ford products received different engine strategies. The 429 Cobra Jet appeared in certain mid-size Ford and Mercury applications, while the Mustang and Cougar continued with the 428 FE. Why? Because packaging was a nightmare. The Mustang's engine bay had evolved from a compact platform. Dropping the larger 429 into that space wasn't as simple as bolting in another V8. The engine was wider and heavier. The 429 was roughly 100 pounds heavier than the 428 in comparable configuration, and the packaging constraints of the existing Mustang platform made the swap considerably more complicated. The 429 required different motor mounts, different exhaust routing, different cooling system considerations. The entire front suspension geometry had to be re-evaluated because of the added weight. That meant Ford had a strange situation. The company had a newer engine ready to go, but the Mustang wasn't ready for it. So the 428 got one final year, and that final year would become legendary. The 1970 Mustang 428 Cobra Jet was effectively the last chapter of the FE's Mustang career. Ford had been using the FE family since the late 1950s, and by 1970, it had powered some of the company's most famous performance machines: the 427 Fairlane, the 427 Galaxy, the original 428 Cobra Jet Mustang from 1968. All of them were FE powered. But the world around it was changing fast. The muscle car era had been built on a simple formula: more engine, more compression, more fuel. But Washington was starting to ask a very different question: how much pollution was acceptable? The Clean Air Act of 1970 brought a new regulatory era, and automakers were facing increasingly strict emissions requirements. At the same time, the compression ratios that had helped make high-performance engines so powerful were becoming harder to maintain. High compression required high-octane fuel. High-octane fuel was becoming more expensive, and the lead additives that helped prevent detonation were being targeted by environmental regulations. The writing was on the wall. Engines with 10.5 to 1 or 11 to 1 compression ratios weren't going to survive the next decade, not in their current form. And there was another enemy: insurance. Young drivers were buying cars with enormous engines and enormous performance potential. Insurance companies were taking notice. Performance cars became increasingly expensive to insure, and that made them less attractive to ordinary buyers. A Mustang with a 428 Super Cobra Jet could cost twice as much to insure as the same car with a 302 small block. For some young buyers, that was financially impossible. The insurance industry was effectively pricing muscle cars out of reach. At the same time, the muscle car market itself was weakening. Mustang sales dropped sharply around this period, and the broader performance car market was beginning to lose the momentum it had enjoyed only a few years earlier. Think about the timing. Ford had spent the late 1960s building increasingly aggressive engines. Now the rules were changing, the buyers were changing, the insurance companies were changing, and Ford's product planners were looking toward a different generation of engines. So what happened to the 428? Ford didn't simply throw it away because it was unreliable. Quite the opposite. The 428 had earned its reputation precisely because it could take punishment. Street racers were putting thousands of hard miles on these engines. Drag racers were making pass after pass without catastrophic failures. The Super Cobra Jet was engineered to handle the abuse. The problem was that Ford no longer needed the FE to be the future. The company needed an engine family that could serve the next decade, an engine that could adapt to emissions regulations, an engine that could work with unleaded fuel, an engine that could be detuned when necessary without becoming completely useless. And that meant the 385 series big blocks. The 429 Cobra Jet became the successor. But here's where the story gets interesting. The 429 wasn't necessarily a weaker engine. In fact, it could be extremely powerful. The 1971 429 Cobra Jet was rated at 370 horsepower and 450 pound-feet of torque. The Super Cobra Jet version was advertised at 375 horsepower and 450 pound-feet. It also received serious hardware, including a 780 CFM Holley carburetor and an oil cooler. Those numbers were higher than the 428 seconds advertised ratings. And the 429 seconds superior breathing meant it had more potential for serious power. So Ford didn't abandon performance, it abandoned the old platform. That's a huge difference. The 428 was the end of the FE era in the Mustang and Cougar. The 429 was the beginning of the next chapter. But that chapter wouldn't last long either. The 1971 Mustang was larger and heavier, approaching 2 tons in some configurations. The entire market was moving in the wrong direction for giant street engines. The 1971 Mustang had grown in every dimension: longer, wider, heavier. It was a grand touring car now, not a compact performance machine, and the numbers tell the story. The 1971 429 Cobra Jet Mustang could still run from 0 to 60 miles per hour in about 6.5 seconds and cover the quarter mile in roughly 14.1 seconds. That was quick, But the era was changing so rapidly that even a car like that was becoming difficult to justify. Then came 1972. The big 429 Cobra Jet disappeared from the Mustang. The engine choices shrank, the horsepower race began collapsing, and the original Cobra Jet era was moving toward its final days. By the middle of the decade, the Cobra Jet name itself would disappear from Ford's mainstream performance lineup. But the 428 Super Cobra Jet didn't disappear quietly. It became something more powerful, a legend. Today, collectors obsess over the details that separated a genuine SCJ from an ordinary Cobra Jet: the special rods, the forged pistons, the oil cooler, the aggressive rear gearing, the correct engine codes, the correct factory configuration, the correct casting numbers on the block, the correct date codes on the components. Every detail matters when you're trying to verify an authentic Super Cobra Jet, because the difference wasn't just horsepower, it was intent. Ford had built the SCJ for people who didn't want the ordinary version. They wanted the version that could take a beating. They wanted the version that could survive repeated drag strip launches. They wanted the version that made the Mustang feel less like a comfortable street car and more like a factory-built weapon. They wanted to know that when they stomped the throttle, everything underneath was strong enough to handle what happened next. And that's why calling the 428 Super Cobra Jet merely a big block misses the point. This engine represented the final stage of an engineering philosophy: build it stronger, give it more displacement, increase compression, improve airflow, strengthen the rotating assembly, cool the oil, add aggressive gearing, then put it in a street car. No computer, no turbocharger, no supercharger, no electronic traction control, no launch control, no stability management, just displacement, compression, fuel, spark, gearing, and mechanical violence. That was the recipe. And Ford knew it couldn't last forever. The FE had been born in a different America, an America where fuel was cheap, where emissions regulations were relatively loose, where insurance wasn't yet punishing high-performance buyers, where manufacturers could openly advertise increasingly outrageous horsepower, and where a young buyer could walk into a dealership and order a car that was barely street legal. By 1970, that world was disappearing. The 428 Super Cobra Jet wasn't killed because Ford suddenly discovered it was a bad engine. It was killed because the world around it had changed. The market had changed. The regulations had changed. The economics had changed. And perhaps that's what makes the story so fascinating. Ford's most dangerous V8 didn't lose a horsepower war. It didn't get destroyed by Chevrolet. It didn't get beaten into retirement by Chrysler's Hemi. It simply reached the end of the road. The 1970 model year became the final appearance of the 428 Cobra Jet in the Mustang and Cougar. After that, Ford moved to the 429 and the newer 385 series architecture, and the 428 seconds final chapter became frozen in time. A big block FE, 428 cubic inches, a 4.13-inch bore, a 3.98-inch stroke, around 10.6 to 1 compression in the later Cobra Jet configuration, roughly 440 pound-feet of torque, and, in Super Cobra Jet form, the hardware necessary to survive the kind of abuse that ordinary street engines were never designed to see. Most people look at those numbers and see an old engine, but look closer. That engine represents the final moment before the muscle car world changed forever. Ford wasn't just ending production of an engine, it was closing the door on an entire philosophy of American performance. The 428 Super Cobra Jet didn't need modern technology to become legendary. It didn't need variable valve timing. It didn't need direct injection. It didn't need forced induction. It needed displacement, strength, and a driver willing to use all of it. That's why the 428 SCJ remains so important. It wasn't the beginning of Ford's big block story. It wasn't even the most powerful engine Ford ever built. It was something more interesting. It was one of the last great mechanical weapons created before the rules changed. And once 1970 ended, you could still buy a fast Ford, but you couldn't buy that exact combination again. The FE era was over, the 428 was finished, and the Super Cobra Jet became history. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Ford's most intimidating engines, let me know what you want to see next. Another forgotten big block, another legendary Cobra Jet, or one of the engines Ford wished people would forget. And make sure you subscribe, because some of the most dangerous engines in American history weren't the ones with the biggest horsepower numbers. They were the ones built when nobody had yet told Detroit to slow down.